There are moments, my dear friends, when a single gesture, small enough that a stranger might miss it entirely, changes the entire shape of a room. I have seen it happen only a handful of times in my life. But when it does happen, you remember it the way you remember the smell of rain on warm pavement, or the particular quality of light on an autumn afternoon when you were very young. You carry it with you, without quite knowing why, for the rest of your days. Come then, settle in. The fire is burning low, but it will last us through the evening. I have a story for you tonight. Her name was Miss Nora Calloway. She was 27 years old, the daughter of a country clergyman from Pembrokeshire, who had died 3 winters past and left behind nothing but a modest library, a worn Bible with his notes in the margins, and a daughter who had taught herself to read Latin from it by the time she was 12. She had no fortune, she had no connections. What she had was a precise and formidable mind, a talent for watercolor that her father had called a gift, and her present employer called a pleasant accomplishment, and the kind of quiet self-possession that some people mistake for coldness and others, the wiser ones, recognize as the armor of someone who has learned not to ask for what they will not be given. She had come to Ashbourne Park in Devonshire 6 months prior as a companion to Lady Seraphina Greer, the eldest daughter of Sir Aldous Greer, a baronet of some property and considerable self-regard. It was not a prestigious position. It was not meant to be. Companions existed in the world of Ashbourne Park, somewhere between the family and the servants, too educated to eat in the kitchen, too poor to eat at the family table without an explicit act of charity, which was never offered in the spirit of charity, but always in the spirit of display. Miss Calloway understood this. She had understood it from her first week, when Lady Seraphina had referred to her in front of a caller as my little reader, the way one might refer to a clever pet. She had not flinched. She had learned by then not to flinch at things that were not worth the energy of flinching. What she did not yet understand, could not have anticipated, was what would happen on the evening of the 14th of November, when Sir Aldous opened Ashbourne Park for the first time that season and invited 40 guests to dine. I want you to hold that date in your mind, my friends. The 14th of November, remember it. The dinner had been planned for weeks. Lady Greer, Sir Aldous's wife, a narrow woman with the social instincts of a chess player, had overseen the arrangements personally. The guest list had been curated with the care of a jeweler sorting stones, and the seating arrangements had been constructed with a precision that would have impressed a military strategist. Every chair at that long mahogany table carried a weight of meaning. Who sat near the candelabra? Who sat near the candelabra? Who sat where the light was flattering, and who sat in the shadows where the wallpaper had begun to peel? Miss Calloway had not expected to dine with the family at all. On ordinary evenings, she took her supper on a tray in the small sitting room off the library, and she had come to prefer it. The library was warm, and the books were good, and no one looked at her as though she were a problem to be managed. But Lady Greer had decided, this once, to be gracious. "You will join us tonight, Miss Calloway," she had said that afternoon in the tone of someone conferring a favor. "It would look odd to have you lurking upstairs when we have so many guests. Besides, Seraphina may need you near." Seraphina, 22, did not need anyone near, but her mother liked to think she did. Miss Calloway had dressed as well as she was able. A gown of deep blue wool that she had made herself, which was better cut than anything Lady Greer suspected a woman of her income could produce, because Lady Greer had never had to sew her own clothing, and had no framework for what precision and patience could accomplish. She had pinned her hair simply. She wore no jewelry, because she owned none worth wearing. She came downstairs at 6:30, and found the drawing-room already filling with guests. The rustle of silk, the smell of candle wax and pomade, voices carrying that particular high brightness that comes when people are performing their best versions of themselves for an audience they wish to impress. And then she saw the table. She saw it before she was meant to, glimpsed through the open doors of the dining room as a footman passed with a tray. The long, glittering sweep of it, the crystal and silver, the arrangement of hothouse flowers in low arrangements so that conversation might flow unimpeded. And at the far end, beyond the reach of the central candelabra, beyond the warmth of the fire, tucked into the corner where the table met the wall at an angle that made rising from one's chair a small athletic challenge, a single-place setting. Hers. She stood and looked at it for a moment. Then she went back to the drawing room and stood near the window, and watched the light fade over the garden, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say, and because she had, over the course of her 27 years, become very good at holding things quietly inside herself where they would not embarrass anyone, and she did not know. She did man across the room watching her. That there was a man across the room watching her. His name was Viscount Ravenhill. Lord Aubrey Ravenhill, to be precise, the eldest son of the Marquess of Dunmore, a man of considerable estate in Northumberland, and of somewhat inconvenient opinions about the way the world ought to work. He was 34 years old. He was not conventionally handsome in the way that the word is usually meant, but he had the kind of face that you noticed and kept noticing, angular, composed, with dark eyes that moved around a room with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who is always paying closer attention than people assume. He had come to Ashbourne Park because Sir Aldous had done business with his father, and because his mother had suggested he circulate more, and because he had found the shooting in Devonshire to be excellent in past years. He was not looking for conversation. He was generally not looking for conversation. He had been told on numerous occasions that this made him seem arrogant, and he had concluded that this said more about the expectations of the people who told him than about his own character. He had noticed Miss Calloway when she came into the drawing-room, not because she was the most striking woman present, though she was, he thought privately, more striking than the assembled silk and pearls gave her credit for, but because she was the only person in the room who was not performing. Everyone else was angled towards someone, projecting, calculating. She stood at the window and looked out at the garden with an expression that was perfectly composed and entirely unreadable, and something about that caught at his attention and held it. He saw the moment she glimpsed the dining-room table. He was watching her face. He saw the stillness that moved through her, like a stone dropped in still water, the single ripple of something, and then the surface closing over it as though it had never been. He looked through the dining-room doors himself. He understood immediately what she had seen. He said nothing, not then. He was a man who thought before he spoke, which was something else people tended to find disconcerting. Dinner was announced at 7. The procession into the dining-room was made in order of precedence, as it always was, and Miss Calloway entered last. Not on anyone's arm, not as part of any pair, but following quietly at the end, the way you might follow a parade once it has already passed, and you are simply going in the same direction. She found her chair without difficulty. It was precisely where she had seen it would be. She sat down. The table was extraordinary, up close. She could appreciate that at least. The floral arrangements were gardenias and late-season roses, and they smelled extraordinary, and the candlelight made everything golden and warm, all the way up at the other end of the table where the family and the principal guests were already settled, their voices rising and overlapping in the comfortable way of people who know they are exactly where they belong. From her corner, she could hear them but not easily join them. To contribute to any conversation, she would have had to raise her voice in a way that would have drawn attention. The wrong kind of attention, the kind that says, "Why is that person trying to be part of something she isn't part of?" So she sat, and she was quiet, and she watched the footman move, and she thought about a watercolor she was working on in the upstairs sitting room, a study of the oak tree at the edge of the east garden, and she wondered whether she had captured the particular grey of November bark. And then she heard a chair scrape, not the casual movement of someone shifting in their seat, a deliberate scrape, the sound of a heavy chair being pulled back from the table with intention. She looked up. Lord Ravenhill was standing. He was standing, and he was picking up his place setting, his plate, his glass, his cutlery, the small arrangement of cards that had designated his seat near the center of the table, and he was carrying these things with complete composure, as though this were an entirely ordinary action, down the length of the dining room. Toward her, 40 people watched him do it, 40 people in their silks, and their dress coats, and their carefully constructed evening arrangements, watched the Viscount Ravenhill walk the length of Sir Aldous Greer's dining room table with his dinner service in his hands. And not one of them said a single word, because there was nothing to say that would not have been worse than silence. He set his things down at the empty place beside her. There was, she noticed, always an empty place. She suspected there always was at this end of the table, a small buffer of nobody to separate her from the guests of consequence, and he pulled out the chair and sat down and settled his napkin in his lap and looked at her with those dark, composed eyes and said quite quietly, "I hope you do not mind. I found the acoustics rather poor from where I was sitting." Miss Calloway looked at him for a long moment. "The acoustics," she said. "Yes," he said, "very difficult to hear properly." "I see," she said. There was a pause in which they were both aware that Ashbourne Park's dining room had perfectly adequate acoustics throughout, and that everyone at the table knew this. "I am Lord Ravenhill," he said. "I know," she said. "I am Miss Calloway." "I know," he said. "You are companion to Lady Seraphina." "I am. And you painted the watercolor in the east hallway, the marsh study with the herons." She looked at him more carefully. "You recognized my work." "Lady Seraphina mentioned it to Lady Greer in the corridor this afternoon. She said you had left it drying in the hallway and she hoped it wouldn't be underfoot. I went and looked at it." He paused. "It's remarkably good." Miss Calloway, who had not been told in perhaps 2 years that anything she produced was remarkably good, and who was therefore entirely unprepared for the sentence, found that she had absolutely nothing to say to it. "Thank you," she said, which was inadequate, and knew it was inadequate, and said it anyway. "Now, my dear friends, I want to stop here for just a moment, because I know what you are thinking. You are thinking, is this the story of a man rescuing a woman? Is this the story of a woman who needed someone to come and sit beside her to make her matter? And I want to tell you, no, that is not this story. Miss Calloway did not need Lord Ravenhill to make her matter. She mattered before he sat down. She mattered in the library with her Latin and her watercolors. She mattered in the blue wool dress she had made with her own hands. She mattered in the quiet, precise, undefeated way she had held herself at that table when she realized where they had put her. What Lord Ravenhill did was simply this. He saw that she mattered in a room full of people who had decided she didn't, and he refused to pretend otherwise. That is a different thing entirely, and it is, I think you will agree, the rarer one. If this story is finding you well tonight, I would ask you to consider staying a while with us here at Moonlight at Ravenwood. Subscribe if you have not yet done so. There are more evenings like this one, more fires to sit beside, more stories worth your time. But for now, come back with me to Ashbourne Park. Because the evening, my friends, is far from over. Dinner proceeded. It proceeded in the particular way that dinners proceed, when something remarkable has happened, and everyone is pretending it hasn't. With a slightly heightened brightness. A slightly more deliberate attention to the conversations immediately in front of each person, as though the act of attending to the person beside you might prevent anyone from having to acknowledge what had occurred at the far end of the table. Sir Aldous was red in the face, not conspicuously. He was too careful a man to display his irritation conspicuously where 40 guests might observe it. But she could see it from where she sat, the particular high colour at his collar that Lady Seraphina had once, in a rare moment of candour, described as the indicator that her father was about to be unpleasant to someone. Lady Greer was doing something more interesting. She was smiling. It was the smile of a woman who is recalculating. Miss Calloway had seen it before, on other faces, in other rooms, and she recognized it the way you recognize weather, not by what it looks like precisely, but by what it means is coming. At the moment, what it meant was that Lady Greer was deciding whether the Viscount Ravenhill's extraordinary gesture was an embarrassment to be quietly cultivated, or an asset, and since Lord Ravenhill was the son of a Marquess, and his annual income was by all reliable accounts something that made Sir Aldous Greer's own property look like a modest gesture, the calculation was not in the end a very difficult one. "You were telling me about your property in Northumberland," Miss Calloway said, not because she had been told anything about it, but because she wanted to give him an opening that was easier than the silence. "I was not," he said, "but I am willing to. Only if it interests you, too. Most things interest me, Miss Calloway, if I am in adequate company." He considered. "Dunmore Castle is cold. That is the first and primary truth of it. It is a very fine house, but it was built in the 13th century by people who had strong opinions about defensibility and very limited interest in comfort. And the result is that every winter you spend half your energy feeding fires, and the other half losing the argument anyway." He paused. "The grounds, however, are extraordinary. There is a river that runs through the East Parkland that I have never adequately described to anyone's satisfaction, including my own. What does it look like?" He thought about it. "Like pewter in the mornings, like something living in the afternoons when the light comes through the beeches. In November it runs very fast and very dark and makes a sound that He stopped. "I am about to sound very foolish." "You are welcome to sound foolish," she said. "I am unlikely to tell anyone." Something shifted in his face very slightly. Something that was almost not a smile. "It makes a sound that I have found myself returning to the window to hear, on certain evenings, when I cannot settle to anything. That is what it sounds like." Miss Calloway thought about the oak tree in the East Garden, the one she was painting, the particular grey of the bark in November. "I understand that," she said. They talked through the soup and through the fish course and through the roast, and the kind of conversation that begins as cautious terrain mapping and becomes, gradually, without either person entirely deciding to allow it, something more genuine. Not confessional, not dramatically intimate, but true. The kind of conversation where you say something you have not said to anyone, not because it is a secret, but because no one has asked. He asked at some point about her father. She told him, straightforwardly, that he had died, that he had been a clergyman with a fine mind and no money, that she missed him with the particular specific ache of missing someone who was also your primary intellectual companion, that she had his Bible still, with his marginalia, and that she had read it more for his handwriting than for the scripture. Lord Ravenhill listened without filling the silence and without offering the usual condolences that were really invitations to stop talking about it. He said, when she had finished, "What did he write?" "In the margins." And she told him that too. Now, I should tell you that at the other end of the table, something else was happening. Miss Seraphina, who was not an unkind young woman, but who had been raised by people with very fixed ideas about what mattered, and who had been watching Lord Ravenhill with a mixture of fascination and bafflement. She had been told by her mother that the Viscount Ravenhill was famously cold, famously difficult to draw out, famously the sort of man who attended dinner parties in order to eat the dinner and had been seen to actually read a book at a ball. He was not, from what she could see, being cold or difficult at the far end of the table. He appeared to be talking to Miss Calloway with a degree of animation that she had never seen him display in the drawing-room before dinner. She leaned toward the gentleman on her left, a Mr. Norwood, who was pleasant and well-informed. "Has Lord Ravenhill always been so?" She searched for the word. "So engaged, at table?" Mr. Norwood glanced toward the far end of the room. "In my experience," he said, "Lord Ravenhill is engaged when he finds something worth engaging with. It is apparently a question of material." Seraphina looked at Miss Calloway, at her blue dress and her unpinned collar and her complete unawareness that she was being observed, and felt something she could not quite name. Some rearrangement of a picture she had been looking at for 6 months without really seeing. After dinner, the company moved back to the drawing-room, and the evening reconfigured itself in the usual way: cards at one table, music at another, conversation in the clusters near the fire. Miss Calloway moved toward the perimeter. She knew her place in a drawing room after dinner with 40 guests. It was the same place it had been at the dining table, more or less, just differently located. She found a chair near the bookshelf and sat, and a footman brought her tea without being asked, which she thought was kind of him, and she held her cup and was content. She expected Lord Ravenhill to migrate toward the principal guests. Men of his rank and age generally did. The drawing room, unlike the dining room, offered no enforced proximity, and she assumed that the table conversation had been pleasant, but that it would remain table conversations. She was wrong. He appeared beside her chair within 10 minutes of the company being settled, carrying his own cup of coffee, and took the chair beside her as though that were simply where he was going. "You are determined to create a pattern," she said. "I am determined to continue a conversation," he said, "which is unusual for me, so I thought I had better follow the instinct. While it persisted, that is either a compliment or a warning, both probably." He settled in. "You were telling me what your father wrote in the margins of the Psalms. You remember that?" "I remember most things," he said. "It is not him about the marge advantage." She told him about the marginalia. She told him about one annotation in particular. Her father's note beside Psalm 131, just 2 words in his careful hand. Enough, still. And what she thought he had meant by it, and thought about the difference between resignation and peace, and how she was not always certain. It was findable, which was something. He listened with his croissant. He listened with his coffee going cold in his hand. "I think," he said when she had finished, "that your father was a man worth knowing." "He was," she said simply. They sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable for a little while, and then an older gentleman appeared. Colonel Whitmore. She had been introduced to him before dinner, a retired officer of perhaps 70, with large hands and a very direct gaze and the sort of posture that suggested he had once been considerably taller and had simply refused to acknowledge the adjustment. He had been sitting alone in the corner near the window, she noticed, for most of the evening. He moved slowly with a cane, and the younger guests had the habit of not quite catching his eye, the way you don't quite catch the eye of someone when you have no intention of inviting them into your conversation. "Lord Ravenhill," the colonel said, stopping beside them. "Forgive the interruption. I wanted to say, I served with your Uncle Edmund at Halifax. 30 years ago now. He was a good man." Lord Ravenhill rose, which he did not have to do for a colonel, and which the colonel noticed, his expression shifting with something that was briefly unguarded. "Colonel Whitmore, please, sit down. I know who you are. You were mentioned in my uncle's letters." The colonel looked surprised and then enormously pleased. "Were you reading his letters?" "My mother kept them. I read everything I can get my hands on." Lord Ravenhill glanced at Miss Calloway. "A condition I appear to share with Miss Calloway." The colonel sat, heavily but with dignity, and Miss Calloway made room, and then the 3 of them were in conversation. About Halifax, about the colonel's years abroad, about a particular winter campaign that the colonel described with the dry precision of someone who had survived it long enough to find it faintly absurd, about the nature of cold in general, and the question of whether Northumberland or the Canadian Maritimes could more legitimately claim the title of genuinely inhospitable. "Canada," said Miss Calloway firmly, and the colonel looked at her with undisguised approval. "You have been." "My father wrote to a missionary friend in New Brunswick for 15 years, she said. "I know everything about February in Fredericton second-hand. I am confident it would defeat me entirely." The colonel laughed, a real laugh, not a drawing-room laugh, and the sound of it drew a glance from across the room, Lady Greer's head turning with the particular attention of someone registering a development. They sat together for an hour, the 3 of them, until the colonel's energy began to flag in the way of a man who will not admit it until it becomes unavoidable, and Lord Ravenhill caught the moment and said, without drawing attention to it, "Miss Calloway, I wonder if Colonel Whitmore might like to rest his leg." There is a better chair by the fire, I think, and this gave the colonel the opening to move without anyone having to say that he was tired, which was the important thing. Miss Calloway stood, and they went together to the fireplace, and she organized the colonel into the better chair with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to seeing what needs doing and doing it. And when Lord Ravenhill looked at her across the top of the colonel's head, something passed between them that was not yet anything nameable, but was the beginning of something that would become nameable, given time. The guests began to leave at 10:30, the carriages called, the candles beginning to gutter in their holders. Miss Calloway found herself in the entrance hall, waiting while Lady Seraphina looked for a mislaid wrap, and Lord Ravenhill appeared beside her. "I am returning to Northumberland at the end of the week," he said. "I thought you might be," she said. "I will pass through Ashbourne on my way north." He paused. "If I were to call here in 2 days, do you think you might be available for a walk in the grounds?" "I am a companion, Lord Ravenhill," she said. "I have very few appointments." That was not precisely an answer. "Yes," she said. "I would be available." There was a pause in which the fire crackled in the hallway grate and someone called for a carriage somewhere outside, and Lady Seraphina continued to not find her wrap. "Your father," he said. "The note in the Psalms, enough, still. I have been thinking about it, and I think I understand what he meant. I think he meant that stillness is a kind of fullness, not an absence, that there is a way of sitting with something, a river, or a conversation, or a person, that is enough, without requiring it to be more than it is." Miss Calloway looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think that's exactly what he meant." He inclined his head, precisely, and went to collect his coat, and she stood in the hall in her blue wool dress with her arms at her sides and the feeling of something warm settling in her chest. Not happiness precisely, not yet, but the edge of it, the sense of a door that is not yet open but is no longer locked, which is perhaps the more important thing. Now, my friends, I could tell you that I left it there. I could let the evening close on that moment in the hallway, which has a certain rightness to it, a completeness. But you deserve the whole of it. So let me tell you what happened 2 days later. He called at 10:30 in the morning, which was punctual without being eager, and she had dressed again in blue. She did not have many choices, and blue suited her, and they walked the grounds of Ashbourne Park in the thin November sunshine, on the gravel paths between the bare hedges, for an hour and a half. And then Colonel Whitmore appeared on the terrace with his cane, and a look of pure delight, and called out, "Miss Calloway, Lord Ravenhill, come and settle an argument. I say the beech at the east wall is 100 years old at least, and the groundskeeper thinks 80. They went. They settled the argument in the colonel's favour. They had tea on the terrace in the cold, the 3 of them, wrapped in coats, and the colonel told a story about a balsam fir in New Brunswick that made Miss Calloway laugh until her eyes watered, and Lord Ravenhill, who smiled rarely and laughed almost never, laughed twice. And that was how it began. They corresponded through the winter. His letters were precise and unexpectedly funny, with small observations about Dunmore Castle in the cold and a continuing series of reports on the river. What colour it was that week, what sound it was making, whether the ice had reached the east bank yet. She replied with watercolour sketches she folded into the envelopes. Not of anything dramatic, just the east garden, the oak tree, the light through the library windows in the late afternoon, and with descriptions of the books she was reading, and her thoughts on them, which grew longer and less careful as the weeks went on. In March, he came back. In April, he asked her to marry him, in the east garden, beside the oak tree, in the particular grey light of an afternoon that was not quite spring yet. She said yes. She said it without hesitation, which surprised her slightly, and then did not surprise her at all. "I want you to know," he said, "that it has never once occurred to me to your position, or your income, or the opinion of anyone who might have an opinion about either." "I know," she said. "That is part of why." Lady Greer received the news with the smile of a woman who has successfully recalculated. Sir Aldous received it with the heartiness of a man who had revised his opinion of the seating arrangement retroactively. Lady Seraphina received it with something more genuine, a real warmth, a wish offered simply without performance. Colonel Whitmore, when he heard, sent a letter to Miss Calloway that contained 3 sentences. The first congratulated her. The second said that he had known, from the evening at the dining-room table, how it would end. The third said that her father, wherever he was, would have found Ravenhill adequate, which was the Colonel's highest form of praise, and she kept that letter for the rest of her life. The wedding was small in Devonshire in May. She wore white. He wore his best coat and looked at her with the expression of a man who has found, unexpectedly and entirely outside the bounds of what he had planned, exactly what he had been looking for. She walked into the church on no one's arm, because there was no one to walk with her, and she held her own flowers, and she looked perfectly steady, and she was. They were married before noon, and in the afternoon they drove north to Northumberland, to Dunmore Castle, with its 13th-century walls and its river that ran like pewter in the mornings and made in the evenings when you could not settle, a sound worth going to the window to hear. She went to the window the very first night. She stood and listened for a long time to the dark, fast water below. And she thought, enough, still. Yes, my dear friends, enough, still. I hope you have found something worth keeping in this evening's story. The fire is nearly done now, and it is late, and you should rest. But before you go, if these evenings by the fire have been good company, I hope you will stay with us here at Moonlight at Ravenwood. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this story with someone who might need it. And come back soon, because I have more to tell you, and the night is long and the stories are waiting. Until then, good night.